Russian forces took the Ukrainian city of Avdiivka, the second significant advance since the culmination of the Ukrainian offensive this past fall. We look at some official reactions, talk about what this means, and then dive into some Russian tactics and how those changed during the course of this incredibly deadly and brutal battle. It's a lot to get into, so I'm glad you're here. I'm recording this at 7 a.m. Central on Sunday, February 18th, 2024. I wanted to start with official statements, official reactions from Ukraine and Russia, because throughout this war, when we've seen territory change hands, there's usually a delay. Russia will say they took something, Ukraine will deny it for days, sometimes even weeks, and then the official word will come out, and the same vice versa. When Ukraine was taking territory this summer, Russia often wouldn't say anything about it for weeks at a time. This time, however, it seems like both sides are at least on the same page, recognizing that the city of Avdiivka, although not the surrounding territory, has turned into Russian control. Starting with the head of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, the newly appointed General Syrskyi, he said, quote, "I decided to withdraw our units from the town of Avdiivka, and move to defense from more favorable lines in order to avoid encirclement and preserve the lines and health of our servicemen." And then looking at Rybar, a Russian publication here, talking about Avdiivka, they say the Russian armed forces established control over key facilities in the city, as well as at least part of the coke plant. Although the cleanup of the settlement is still ongoing, we can already talk about the end of the battle for the city, which has been ongoing with varying intensity since 2014, which is a big part of why the fall of Avdiivka is significant. We'll get into kind of the strategic and tactical aspects here as well, but for one, this is an area that has been fought over, similar to Marinka, has been fought over between Russia and Ukraine since 2014. So what that has meant largely is that Ukraine has been able to establish a significant defensive presence there. Russia has long talked about entire bunker complexes that they're trying to clear through Avdiivka. So a 10-year battle just culminated, right? This one is not, a couple. There was a major offensive that kicked off here a few months ago, but this is not a new fight. This is a 10-year-old battle for the city of Avdiivka. So looking at what it means, according to the Russian Defense Ministry, they referred to Avdiivka as a powerful defensive hub. And they said that taking Avdiivka would move the front lines away from Donetsk city, reducing Ukraine's ability to shell the Russian stronghold. So that's kind of how Russia is presenting one of the reasons for taking Avdiivka, is pushing the Ukrainian armed forces further away to where they can no longer shell the Russian elements that have now taken over the occupied city of Donetsk. Now, previous in this war, analysts and strategists have looked at certain cities, towns, and intersections that are being fought for and thought, well, if that falls, that opens the gates for, in this case, Russian forces to move further into Ukraine. Think of Popasna and Bakhmut, a little further north from Avdiivka, about a year ago. One of the concerns there was that if Russia takes these towns, it gives them access to these key roads where they could then press forward directly into Sloviansk and Kramatorsk. That hasn't happened. We're a year later, and that scenario did not play out after Bakhmut fell. What's generally happened is that after these cities fall to Russian forces, Ukraine just moves back and reinstalls a new defensive line a couple kilometers from where it was previously. So cities like Bakhmut, Marinka, and now Avdiivka, those are significant strongholds. There was significant defensive positions well established within those cities, but they're nowhere near the last line of defense for Ukraine. And I think at times we've fallen in the trap of assuming that is the only defensive posture. In reality, what we've seen is these are more appropriately viewed as the first line of defense in a relative defense in depth when it comes to the overall defense of the Ukrainian country. That said, Ukraine understandably so, does not want to give up any territory at all. They'd rather not give up an inch of their territory to Russian forces, but if they have to, as is the case here in Avdiivka, they were forced to withdraw. They are going to want to make it as costly as possible, which is where the potential significance or the more significant aspect of this battle for Avdiivka comes in. So when we're looking at what it cost, there were a couple, I'll say first-person accounts coming from Avdiivka that I thought were worth diving into. The first one here is from an American volunteer fighting in Ukraine, Ryan O'Leary. He's on Twitter at X, worth following, puts out some incredible first-person accounts of what is happening on the battlefield with he and his soldiers. He says, casualty-wise, wounded, killed, and captured, Bakhmut was likely higher than Avdiivka. Deaths only, Avdiivka was likely 2 times worse for the Russians than Bakhmut. Then, looking back, according to the late Yevgeny Prigozhin, leader of the Wagner Group, he at one point said that Wagner had lost 20,000 fighters killed at Bakhmut, which this would suggest means as many as 40,000 Russians were killed at Avdiivka, which would be absolutely wild. Again, take all of these casualty figures with a grain of salt, as we have throughout this entire war, and we'll talk more to these figures here in a moment. Moving back to O'Leary, he says the easiest way to explain this is terrain and the buildup of fortifications. Even in the areas of the flanks, the opening day of the Russian offensive in our sector, over a dozen BMPs were destroyed before they got within 800 meters of Ukrainian lines. The infantry on and in that initial assault were caught out in the open and mowed down rather quickly. He said day after day, for 2 or 3 weeks, they continuously, the Russians, attempted to run armor at fortified lines. In our sector, after they ran out of BMPs and BTRs, they used troop transport trucks to try to get infantry as close as possible. These vehicles, more often than not, were hit by FPV or drones, and then they waited for dismounts and hit the infantry with drone-dropped grenades. He said we made it a point to try and hit every enemy soldier still alive. If they crawled into a bunker, throw them a bear grenade. If they were crawling in an open field, grenade drop. The reason for that, and he gets into it in a second, is that these soldiers were massing forward. Russia was using anything they could, it sounds like, to move soldiers forward and then had the infantry push forward for the last few meters at a time. So it wasn't a matter of, traditionally you would see a company of 100 soldiers. If 90 of them are killed or wounded, you would say that that unit is no longer combat effective. You might not spend a lot of energy going after the onesies and twosies that are left behind. In this case, they were, because those onesies and twosies would mass together and form a new unit and continue to press forward. O'Leary says mid to end of November, though, something changed. No longer were the Russians attempting 50-men assaults. They'd move in groups of 8 to 12 men. If 2 or 3 made it, they'd hide amongst the rubble. The next group would move 5 to 15 minutes behind the first, and they'd do the same. Once the survivors regrouped and had 20 or so men spread out in 2 positions or more, they'd push forward while a new rear element pushed up from behind, and they would mass creeping fires and drones while doing so, only stopping once the Russian infantry were within 25 to 50 meters of our positions. They adapted their tactics to run as a mass of smaller human waves with less armor and more foot infantry to knock out a few meters of the killing fields at a time. I want to think about that for a second, step back, and just recognize these 50 soldiers that are running across no man's land, essentially, that gets knocked down to 2 or 3 at a time that make it and then hide amongst the rubble. Those are people. Those are human beings. Those are fathers, sons, brothers. That's brutal for day after day, week after week. Disposable is the term that comes to mind. To use human beings in this manner without adequate armored cover, without adequate artillery or air support, to just send them out in the hopes that a couple people make it, that'd be great, and then they can stay up in the rubble, and then once they're there, they're still not safe. They're going to wait until a group of 15 or 20 of them are together, and then they're going to push forward even further, straight into Ukrainian lines. I haven't heard much about the use of convict units in or around Avdiivka, but this sounds very similar to how Russia was using some of those organizations or some of those units in Bakhmut, where, again, the term being thrown around, and I think when you hear it described like this, it's accurate, disposable infantry. They're being disposed of to take a couple meters at a time. Then in wrapping up here, O'Leary said they didn't try to dig in. They just hid wherever they could. One position we constantly fought over, which he calls Objective Kiev, was littered with dead enemy soldiers. There were well over 100 Russians strewn about in front and inside of it. So again, then there are a couple things I wanted to get at here. O'Leary uses the term human wave attacks, and I think in the past it's been easy to brush that aside because we think of World War I style, hundreds or thousands of soldiers in line running across an open field. However, when you're looking at, and then it's shot down as just propaganda, this isn't actually happening. But when you look at a scenario of even 20, 40, or 50 soldiers moving across open terrain within Ukrainian artillery, mortar, FPV, drone, and direct fire range, what else are you going to call that? If they don't have armored support, if the artillery support is waiting for enough of them to get killed that they make it far enough up to be worthwhile of artillery support, That is human wave in a sense, right? Then turning to some opinions from Russian Milblogger Mers here, very pro-Russian. So that's the angle you're getting from his statements. He's not all that happy with how this played out, and this was a theme looking through a handful of Milblogger channels, Russian Milblogger channels. They recognize that the fall of Avdiivka is significant. Again, Russia's been fighting over this with Ukraine for 10 plus years. So the taking of Avdiivka cannot be brushed aside as nothing. It is significant, and there's a lot of people that gave their lives to get to this point. However, a lot of these Milbloggers, Mers included, suggest that the cost might have been outlandish. It might not be sustainable, and kind of tamp down the celebrations, if you will. And there was another one, let's see if I can find it and put it up here, where one of the Milbloggers is pushing back on this idea that Ukraine just gave up the city. And he said, I'm sure that the hundreds or thousands of dead Russian soldiers would like to hear that Ukraine just gave up. There's very clearly a very lethal and deadly fight up until the last moment here. So turning to Mers's comments here, he said 4 tank regiments extinguished themselves in advancing several kilometers over 4 months, and 1 extinguished tank division. Gone. Just eliminated. No longer here. 4 tank regiments and 1 tank division. He says since October, 16,000 irretrievable losses on our part and about 300 units of knocked out armored vehicles. Irretrievable losses, again, moving through some of the translation here, that can be tough. I would take that to mean either killed or wounded in such a way that they're not able to make it back to the fight in any way, shape, or form. He says, the enemy, having carried out a defensive battle and suffered, in the best case for us, irretrievable losses of 5,000 to 7,000 during the same time, which he says is his rough estimate. And then they say goodbye and fall back to newly prepared positions. So in Mers's estimate here, he says 5,000 to 7,000 Ukrainians were killed or significantly wounded against 16,000 for Russia. So, 2 to 3 times in terms of the ratio there for Ukraine, which is an important aspect to take away here if that is the case. So anytime that either side takes territory in this or other wars, that's a very tangible sign that you can point to in terms of a victory. Look, they held that territory. They were defending it. We took it. We won. It's very easy. That's something that you can take pictures of, look at maps, send back to the public. It's easy to understand, and that's what Russia is doing right now around Avdiivka, understandably so. It's what Ukraine did this past summer in southern Ukraine. However, how it affects the outcome of the war probably has more to do with the total number of losses sustained by each side, and that's probably going to remain unknown to the public for quite a while here. I mean, we do have, as we ran through in this video, some guesses, but it's far from anything official, right? So one thing we have to keep in mind is that Ukraine will lose this war, without a doubt, if they maintain a 1-to-1 loss ratio with Russia. They can't do that. Even 2-to-1 might not be sustainable long-term, given the available resources between these two countries. However, there is a point, and your guess is as good as mine here, where that ratio could be so skewed in Ukraine's favor that this inch-by-inch, meter-by-meter progress that Russia is taking becomes untenable over the long term. Obviously, we haven't gotten there yet, given the fact that Russia continues to press the attack in multiple areas, but given the gap in Western aid flowing into Ukraine right now, it's likely or unlikely that Ukraine is going to be able to kick off any major offensive this summer, which means that it's more likely they're going to continue to pursue this attritional style approach to the ongoing war. With that being the focus, it's that ratio number that becomes so important. If Ukraine has to give up an area like Bakhmut or Marinka or Avdiivka, of course, they don't want to do that. They never want to give up any of their territory, but if they do, they have to be able to exact such a toll on Russian forces in a ratio, recognizing that some Ukrainians are and will continue to be killed so long as the fighting goes on. If they can exact a toll within this ratio that makes it untenable for Russia long term, that is likely to become the Ukrainian strategy here for the coming weeks, months, and pending, the scale and scope of Western aid, this could be the strategy for years still to come. But that's all I've got for now. Of course, if interested in this or other national security subjects, be sure to check out the Substack, linked in the description below. We just brought some staff on board, writers, analysts, researchers, putting together kind of in-depth looks at subjects that are adjacent to what I'm talking about in these videos. They're all free. Hopefully you find some value there. Again, linked in the description below. But thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.